Hello all, this is Daniel Berman, USCF Expert 2109, and today I'd like to go over a game I played last week at the Santa Monica Blitz Invitational Tournament, which was a 16-player tournament with an average rating of a little over 2100, and I was fortunate enough to share first place with Carl Hine. And if you do a search for the Carlini files on YouTube, you'll find about 35 of his videos, and they're pretty funny. I got a lot of material to cover in this game. I'm going to show you the game and the main line and a sideline. Okay, so in this game it was round 3, and I had won my first 2 games, and my opponent Daniel Lawrence, rated 2059, had won his first 2 games, and I played the black side of the Budapest. So the opening began d4, knight f6, c4, e5. Now this is the beginning of the Budapest. Pawn takes pawn, knight to g4. Here white has 3 good moves. The most common one is bishop to f4, and the next is knight f3, and the next is e4. And my opponent played bishop f4, and a normal response to this line is knight to c6. But in this game, I decided to try to see if I can get into my pet line, which starts with bishop to b4 check. And here my opponent would normally have 2 moves, knight to d2 and knight to c3. And if he plays knight to d2, I can get into my pet line, which I'd like to show you in a little bit. But here my opponent played knight to c3. If instead he would have played knight d2, my pet line would start with d6. And by the way, if I wanted to, I could actually get back into the main line with knight c6. d6, pawn takes pawn, and here I have queen to f6 attacking the bishop on f4, the pawn on b2, and if you look, the pawn on f2 is being attacked by my knight, and if he moves the bishop too far away, maybe in some lines I can possibly take it with my queen, which would be checkmate. But the main line here would go e3, knight takes f2, and king takes f2. And if you are unprepared for this variation, it's very dangerous for white. And that's one of the reasons why I like it, because it actually scores very well in chess space. This line for black is getting 67%. And here, the game would continue g5, knight to e4, queen to b2, knight to e2, and gf4. And this position is very precarious for white. If he takes with a pawn, I may have f5, kicking the knight, and bishop f4, and the king would go on a king hunt. And I'm not too concerned about my pawn on c7 being weak. I'm more concerned about his king, winning his king. A high-level game went queen to d4, pawn takes f3, king takes f3, queen takes queen, knight takes queen, bishop takes, knight takes bishop, pawn takes knight to b5, threatening c7 and d6, knight to a6, knight takes, and knight back to b5. And here, I think black's doing very well. Both our kings are in the center. I have a pawn closer to my king, so I can possibly hide behind it, and his king's a little bit exposed. His c-pawn is weak, and I can play knight to c5, getting a permanent post from my knight, and bishop to e6, attacking that c-pawn, kick the knight on b5 with a6, and I'm very happy with my game here. Okay, so let's go back to this position, and instead of d6, the main line would be knight c6, knight gf3, queen e7, and now he can't guard that pawn anymore. So there's 2 moves here. There is either a3, kicking the bishop, or e3, which Karpov played against Nigel Short in one of the World Championship cycle games. And actually Karpov won this game. And this is probably the best move, e3. And I want to show you this line, a3, because of a potential quick checkmate threat, which would start with knight takes e5. Now if you were to recapture the bishop right away with a b4, knight to d3 is checkmate, a surprising checkmate. And the main line would normally be knight takes e5, knight takes e5, and still you can't take the bishop because of knight d3 checkmate. So this is the main line. So that brings us to on bishop e4 check. my opponent played not knight d2, knight to c3. And I continued with the main line variation after knight to c3 with knight to c6, knight to f3, queen to e7, and queen to d5. Because the knight went to c3, he can go queen to d5, guarding the e5 pawn one more time. So I still am not able to take that pawn. So I decide, which is still book, to play f6. Pawn takes f6, and now I play bishop takes knight check, doubling his c-pawns, giving him weak queenside first before recapturing on f6. Now I recapture on f6, hitting his queen. His queen goes to d3, and now his bishop is attacking my c7 pawn, so I guard it, and he plays g3, knight to e4, bishop g2, and knight to c5. Queen e3. This position is all mainline Budapest Gambit, the real Gambit, where you actually lose the pawn. Black loses the pawn. At this point, I didn't know what to do, so my opponent actually knew what to do a little bit longer, but I had an idea what I should be doing. I should be going after the weak c-pawns. And the best move would have been probably knight to a5, but I played queen to e3. So let's take a look at an actual game with knight to a5 where black wins. And the variation goes knight to d2, bishop to e6, bishop to d5, castles, knight to b3, knight takes b3, pawn takes b3, and queen f7. Now, in this position, I'm attacking the b pawn. I'm double attacking the bishop on d5. So if he plays b4, I got bishop takes, pawn takes, queen takes. I'm on the rook on h1, castles, and my knight's hanging, and I bring the knight back. So this is almost entirely forced variation. However, this next move probably wasn't forced. But if you look, the bishop on f4 has really no squares. Can't go to h6 or g5. So I'll just take it. So he just goes rook takes pawn, and I go rook takes rook, queen a7, rook takes f4. Black spots a weakness on g2. Plays f3 to stop the checkmate on g2. Queen check on g5. King to f2, knight to h3, king to e1, and queen c1 check. Mate. This is the end of part 1. Please come back for part 2.